I mix real and made up characters because firstly I'm writing historical novels, and there were a lot of people in history. I mean, this is again something that you may not find in some historical novels. But any time you want a really fascinating, contradictory, interesting character, look in reality. It is very, very difficult to keep up with reality for weirdness and extraordinary eccentricities and things you just couldn't get away with as a writer. I remember when I was researching Do We Not Bleed, and I found a book called what was it? I found a book called something like what is it when you get a devil who gets inside you and then possession, that's right.
Possession.
Yes, I found a book called An Elizabethan Lawyer's Possession by the Devil. Now, I hadn't even thought of having an Elizabethan lawyer possessed by a devil, but of course once I'd seen it I had to use it, so I used it. How could they tell is the first thing that would obviously spring to mind. And indeed it would have been difficult because Elizabethan lawyers were dreadful people, but which I hope I get a little flavour of in the book. But you get these characters. You couldn't make up Sir Robert Cecil, who was the second son of Lord Burleigh, who was Elizabeth's Chancellor. And he was a hunchback. He'd had very severe rickets as a child because his diet was supervised by doctors, and so they didn't allow him to eat vegetables or dairy products because that was too low for him. He had to eat just meat. So as you can imagine, it's not very good for you. So he had rickets as a child and grew up with quite a severe hunchback, and yet became a very, very clever politician, clever and also a very good head of a secret service. Essentially, he took over Walsingham's secret service and put it back together again. It had suffered from being commanded by the Earl of Essex. And he's a most fascinating character because he seems to have had quite a humorous nature, quite a funny man in many ways. There's some very dry comments made by him. And Elizabeth called him her dwarf, which was typical of Elizabeth. It was a very great honour to have a nickname, and I'm sure he didn't like the nickname very much. And I've always thought, and this is a very interesting idea, but I may one day do something about the writing of Richard III, because I think that Sir Robert Cecil was quite knowingly a model for the Richard III that we know from Shakespeare. So it's very interesting. You've got all these marvellous people. I use a real person, for instance. I didn't mean to do this, but it was just I couldn't resist the temptation that Shakespeare happened to meet when he was in London a friend of his called Dick Stubbs, who was a printer from Stratford-on-Avon, and Dick Stubbs eventually printed Venus and Adonis and all of Shakespeare's, well, not all of them, but some of Shakespeare's plays. So it was like, you've got these marvellous people. They're all sort of turning up. And I'll tell you one thing that happened to me when I was researching. It was for, I can't remember, A Plague of Angels. And I was researching an Elizabethan, well, basically, if the Sun had existed, the Sun tabloid newspaper had existed in Elizabethan England, Richard Green would have been writing for it. He wrote the coney catching pamphlets, and he wrote an enormous, there are 12 volumes of Robert Greene's writings. So I kind of went to the British Library, called them up. I couldn't have all of them, so they sent me the first 3 volumes. because I thought, well, Robert Greene, he was around London, he was doing stuff. Maybe he and Sir Robert Carey knew each other. There was not a real reason to think so, except that Carey's father, the Lord Chamberlain, was Shakespeare's patron later on. That's the only thing I went by. So I called them up, got the big volumes out, opened it up, and on the first page, the dedication page, there was a letter of dedication from Robert Greene to Sir Robert Carey, his patron. I looked at it and I just laughed. Everyone went, shh. Because, yeah. Yeah, brilliant. It's wonderful. Wonderful when that happens. And you'd be astonished how often it does. One thing I'm a little proud of was the Crow Goddess. Going back to one of my earlier books, the Crow Goddess assumes that there was a Roman expedition, a small Roman expedition to Ireland around about 120 AD, which was what finally did for Cuchulainn. And I based this on one of the legends. One of the legends of the Toimbo Cooley is that Cuchulainn was fighting a great red giant with 200 legs, 200 arms and 100 heads. I thought, what's that? And I kind of thought, and I thought, I know what that is. That is a Roman cohort, not a legion, because a legion's much bigger. That's a Roman cohort you're looking at through the eyes of a barbarian who's going, what's that? As they march along. And so I wrote this, and it came out in 1978. And in the late 80s, they did some archaeological excavations in Dundalk, which is where Cuchulainn had his tribal area, and they found a Roman camp. It's great. You can't make this up, but it's great.
Well, you can.
Well, I did. I made it up. I made
yeah.
it up, and then it came. Well, it was true.
Yeah.
But I made it up on the basis of some oral history, which I think oral history is very reliable, so long as you look at it the right way. It isn't actually history. The stories kind of coalesce into each other, and characters very often do the same. But the events, and very often odd little details around the events, those are consistent, those stay. People remember those.